Hello! Today's topic is Western expansion and farmers unite. And this is how America deals with the settlement of the West. And this is particularly difficult because it was also known as the Great American Desert due to the lack of rainfall, the lack of water. How do you settle a region which is dry as a bone? So, we're taking a look at how farmers manage to eke out a living? How did they get there in the first place? How are the changing dynamics and demographics of the time, especially involving the people who already lived there, which was the Native Americans? What are the impacts on them? And how do Americans exploit this region for their own material gain? And what are the effects of that? So, if you're going through your slides, I can't play it through this means, but I really suggest that you play this video and you try and correlate what you know about American history with population movement and trying to identify why the population moves in a certain way. Now, if you skip to 1860, you're going to start to notice a very clear divide in America using the Mississippi River right in the middle of the country as okay, here's all the people over here in the East, and there aren't any people that we see as part of America to the West, except, in some cases in California and in Utah. And you start to see in 1860 with the Homestead Act and the Transatlantic Railroad, we start to see settlements and population go into the Great American Desert. And this has a profound impact, not just on the people, but also on the environment. So, what causes this great push westward? Well, there's this economic drive to move west. All the land's being taken up in the east, there's land out west. So the government, in order to incentivize people to move into the great American desert and try and eke out a living during the American Civil War, all right, keep in mind, America is fighting for its very survival and unity. We're still thinking about the future, Congress and the president. And they come up with the Homestead Act in 1862, which you get land if you move out west and you work on it for 4 or 5 years. A lot of people will try and do this. Most will fail because again, it's the great American desert, and you also have the changing times as the Industrial Revolution, as mass consumption and railroads make it more and more difficult for farmers to be successful. But the Homestead Act does move a lot of people west. Along with that, how did they get west? Well, back in the day, you had these caravans that would go out west. But as these caravans went out west, you also had, in conjunction with this, the building of the Transatlantic Railroad. Sorry, the Transcontinental Railroad. And this is a railroad, and actually several railroads become transcontinental, that crosses all the way from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. So the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, it authorized government funding for this railroad. And the reason why they needed the government to fund this railroad is one, the Constitution says Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. But most importantly, there's no profit to be had because there's no settlements. How are you going to make money? You're building a railroad to nowhere. All right. But in building that railroad to nowhere, all along that railroad, there will be people moving and therefore be profit in the long term, but not the short term. So, how do you make up this gap? How do you get this railroad to nowhere, which will eventually be very successful? You need the government. And this is when you start to see the government step in and really help big businesses directly through government funding, through subsidies. Whereas before it was usually through protective tariffs. Okay, we're going to protect, industries from foreign competition. Now you have direct subsidies from the government going to companies without that much regulation. So you start to see a lot of corruption during this period. So why go out west? What is out west? Well, one, there's a lot of material resources. especially gold. And if you have an economy that uses gold as its main money supply, and there's gold to be had in those hills and those rivers, people are going to go out there and try and get that gold. So there's gold in Colorado, there's gold in Nevada, there's silver, there's all these excellent resources to be mined. However, it's very destructive. So the first wave of the miners, they're going to pan for gold in the rivers, but then you start to have big companies come in and start to use hydraulic mining to break apart the rock. And this can be very destructive to the environment. It can pollute the environment, as we see with the picture right there. Um, Very dangerous to work. So who's going to be working these conditions? Well, most of them are going to be foreign born immigrants coming over, working low wage, high risk jobs. Um, that's primarily the people who are doing these jobs. As it says, half the population was foreign born. You also have, outside of the mountains and the mining area, you have the big cattle industry. So imagine these great plains, these rolling plains filled with grassland. And so cowboys they'll round up these cattle, they'll raise them the cattle in Texas, and they'll move up north to the great railroad hubs of Kansas City. And they're going to move all this cattle, all right, in this open range to the railroad depot, which will then take this cattle to Chicago and eastern cities to be slaughtered, and then for the cities to have food to eat. And so you have this economic incentive for cattle ranching. However, as these railroads come and they pick up the cattle, they're also bringing settlers and barbed wire and all the things of quote unquote civilization. And therefore, the cowboys and the open ranching thing quickly dies off. It does not last a long time because people take claim for the land. And now you have ranches in which there's a clearly defined, okay, I can raise my cattle in here. So you also have environmental issues like overgrazing. Um, this also puts you in competition with Native Americans of the era because the cattle, again, they're eating the grass, they're consuming the environment that the Native Americans are depending upon to survive. So know about the Comstock load, know about Pikes Peak, know about the boom and bust cycle of the economy, because you have these great, awesome economic gains, but then you have these crashes that follow. All right, now we have this idea, or at least I have this idea of the West, and that comes from the 1950s. In the 1950s, people look back sentimentally at the closing of the frontier. You also had the beginning of the new frontier, the space age. So there's this weird conjunction of people are looking in the future, Star Trek, space, but they're also looking in the past and thinking about, okay, cowboys, etc. There is a big difference between the myth of the West and the reality of the West. And there's some things that they did get right. And this is because people were romanticized even back then about the West. You have these dime store novels in which it's really cheap, novel of, oh, okay, is the gunslinger from Arizona, etc., and cowboys and the glory and heroes, etc. But the reality is, it wasn't just, white guys with white hats, going around saving the day. Cowboys were primarily African American and Mexican. And you don't see that in the films of the 1950s, but it was definitely a reality back then. It was a very tough life. And those people who did it, they did it because it was better than, maybe in the South, or, it's what they were raised to do in their families as time went by. You also have Chinese immigration. So the building of the western part of the railroad was primarily by Chinese immigrants. A very dangerous job. You're blowing into mountains. You're building tunnels. You have cave-ins. High risk, low pay, but better pay than back home. So you have Chinese immigration coming in, and you don't really see that much in the American Western literature. You also have women's suffrage. So as women move out west, they're gaining more rights in the quote uncivilized region. So they're actually able to vote. They're actually in Wyoming is the very first state women are granted the right to vote. So you see the women's rights movement move out westward as America moves out westward. But there comes a cost as America moves westward to create farms, to do cattle ranching. And one of the things that's getting in the way of that is the Native Americans and their primary food source in the Great Plains, which was bison. So you had these tremendous groupings of bison moving back and forth along the plains, consuming the grassland, etc. Well, that's in the way of farming. That's in the way of cattle ranching. Native Americans moving around and living their traditional lifestyle is in the way of quote unquote American progress. And the railroads, because it's getting in the way of the railroads. Railroads have to stop, the trains have to stop as these bison herds cross, that destructive to what they're trying to build. And therefore, there is this calling out to let's kill the buffalo. And so here we have a giant mound of bison heads. And there's literal stories of people on railroads as they're passing by these bison herds just hanging out the train and shooting the bison, all right, as quote sport. So this killing off the bison herd, and it almost makes it extinct. It really puts tremendous pressure on the Native Americans because this is their primary food source, and it forces them off of where they normally live, and that makes life even more difficult. Remember, it's the Great American Desert. It's difficult to live during this region, especially if your main food supply is killed off. As a result of the movement westward, it displaces the Native Americans. And we see this a commonality throughout American history in which European settlers, American settlers will come. Initially, things will be okay with the Native Americans of the area. There'll be trade. People will live together in a bit of harmony. But eventually there comes this economic pressure as settlements grow, as they eke into the land that the Native Americans rely to get their food source, because most of them are not, full scale farmers. They're living off the land and they need a lot of land to live off of to live in that way. You start to get this conflict. And again, the Native Americans are unable to deal with European settlement, American settlement, because they don't have the demographic numbers. They don't have that's the population base. They don't have the technology. They don't have the industrial support. And they're constantly losing these wars. And it's not one identity. It's you have hundreds, you have thousands of tribes, and they don't all get along together. So over time, Native Americans are forced off their land, and you see this in the West. They just are known as the last group of Native Americans to lose in this manner. And you also have massacres. You have massacres on both sides, as atrocity begets atrocity. You have the Sand Creek Massacre, Colorado militia attack and kill over 100 Native people. You have the Battle of Little Bighorn. Custer kind of brought it on himself by going onto this land, but all the men die. You have settlers attacked, though in the Western literature they make it much more than it actually was. You have scalping. There's atrocities, and the Native Americans lose, and they're forced onto reservations. Now, if you want to read a little bit interesting about local history, read about the Yuma Wars. There's a link right here. Go there, learn all about the Yuma Wars. It's rather fascinating what happened because we're right on the Colorado River, and you can learn a little bit about the tribes in the area. The Wounded Knee. So, as the Native American tribes in this area are losing, especially the Lakota, to the enemies of the Lakota, they called them the Sioux. But to themselves, they called themselves Lakota. And to kind of deal with this loss, because remember, they're ravaged by disease, they're losing wars, they're kicked off their land, the bison herds are a thing of a past. They want to remember their history. They want to bring back the good times. And there's this religious movement, not a military movement, but a religious movement called the Ghost Dance movement, and it kind of scared the United States government and settlers, and it results in the federal government coming in to stop this, and it results in one of the most infamous massacres that marks the end of the Native American, quote, frontier wars, and that is the Battle of Wounded Knee, which is not really much of a battle. It was a slaughter. U.S. Army goes in to the Dakotas, into the land where they're not supposed to go, because it's supposed to be their land, and they kill 200 people, men, women, and children. And you see here's a mass grave that was dug to put the victims of this massacre in. So it gets worse for the Native Americans because their culture is removed. Now, this wasn't malicious in nature. There was this, as people were reading about these massacres and they started to be sentimental, especially about what the Native Americans were losing. And so you have people who want to help. However, they're a product of their time. And the product of that time meant, well, we need to save these Native Americans because they're dying and they're losing what they had. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to make them like us. And so you have this process of assimilation that they want to have done. And the first thing is remove this tribal identity. So get rid of the tribes no longer exist. Let's break up the reservation land, and Native Americans can farm the land just like the white settlers can. And to get rid of their tribal identity, their culture, their religion, and make them more assimilated, we're going to build these schools. The most famous one is the Carlisle Indian School, and we're going to forcibly take the children of Native Americans, and we're going to place them in these schools, and we're going to forbid their native language. We're going to dress them uh, like white people were dressed, not Native Americans, and we're going to change them and, quote, civilize them. This is very unsuccessful. There's a lot of corruption at this time. A lot of the Indian land goes to white settlers. You have tales of atrocity and deaths in the schools. You have the destruction of a culture, many different cultures unique to the area. You have the destruction of tribal life, and it's going to destroy uh, many Native American tribes, and some Native American tribes will seek to reclaim their identity and culture after these assimilation attempts are removed. The most famous of these is Helen Hunt Jackson, and she will write a book here, a Century of Dishonor, talking about how the Native Americans have been mistreated. You also have, and this will cause like the Carlisle School and these different types of policies. You also have the Dawes Severalty Act that splits up the Native American land into 160-acre plots. Here's a path towards citizenship. Here's a path towards, quote, a better life. Doesn't really work out that well. So we see here's a look at population of Native Americans compared to the overall population. And we see here, this is where Native Americans make up a majority or a growing majority of the population. And we can look on the reservation map and it kind of correlates right there. So even today, Native Americans mainly are on reservation land. While their numbers went down, especially in the 1900s they've picked back up, and there are now more Native Americans than there were in 1900. So the Native population is growing, and you see some reversal of the wrongs put on them prior. But it's it's a debated topic. It's a debated topic of how to deal with this past. So, closing of the frontier. So the West is now closed, right? It's settled. People are living there. Now what? All right. That's the primary thing. Now what? And so Frederick Jackson Turner writes the significance of the frontier in American history about the psyche of having a frontier, of this outlet where people can go, this American identity of we're constantly moving westward, we're constantly expanding, manifest destiny. And this will connect with, okay, well, we reached the Pacific Ocean. Now what? Well, what's out there beyond the Pacific Ocean? And this is where we're going to get into imperial expansionism, American imperialism, um, America looking outside of its borders for a new frontier. During this time, it's a tough time, even as farmers. We're going to pause it right there. So, farmers are having an especially difficult time during this period because of industrialization, new technologies, and the price of the food that they're producing is dropping rapidly. And so the profitability of farms is decreasing. It's forcing a lot of people off the farms into cities working. So, what do the farmers who are still farming do to try and solve this problem? The main thing that you need to remember is the Populist Party. And this is a kind of a last ditch effort by farmers to try and fix their main problems. That is falling prices, unfair railroad business practices, where they're charging more for small farms compared to big corporations, high cost of machinery, limited money supply, and high tariffs. So, to solve this issue, they want to have silver in the economy. They want to add silver to the gold and cause massive inflation. All right. They want to cause massive inflation to the economy. And so you have a sizable portion of people supporting this, particularly farmers, and then you have industrialists and urban workers who end up turning against this. The most famous candidate for this presidential candidate is William Jennings Bryan, who made the famous speech that you shall not crucify me upon a cross of gold. And he ran for president in 1896 and he lost. But some of these things did happen. The direct election of senators, now people elect the senators, whereas before it used to be by the state senates. We also see more things in which, like in Arizona, you can vote on specific laws and make them a reality through direct voting rather than through the legislative bodies. You see a number of court cases that involve issues related that the farmers are having. The Wabash case, the Munn v. Illinois. You have a movement of farmers called the Grange Movement, and this is more like a local community get together type organization, but they will evolve into something more for a short period of time. But this is farmers trying to get together. One of the main things that kept farmers disunited was racism. And so African American farmers, there were a large number of African American farmers, especially in the South, were unable to work with white farmers. And therefore, they were disunited, and that hurt the farmers' cause. But by the end of the 19th century, um, the farmers would not be an effective political party anymore because most people would become urban workers. Now, urban workers weren't getting too good of a deal either, and you're going to note a number of different industrial problems. That is strikes, that is marches, talking about the unemployed, and the government really doesn't listen to them because of the laissez-faire. And Grover Cleveland goes down as one of the most unfavored presidents because he continues to support this laissez-faire and not helping out urban workers. And you have some very violent clashes in society during this time period. So, note overall, during this time period, this is a time of change. This is a time of strife. And the things that people really focus on, the progressive movement, the square deal, Theodore Roosevelt, all these things come to fruition because of the struggles of the labor movement, because they're not listened to, because of the boom and bust cycle of the economy, because of the division in American society at this time. So, this really is the foundation for the 20th century: the Square Deal, the New Deal, the changing of the tides. That will conclude today's lecture.